Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 318. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by Lee Konitz with Warne Marsh, which originally came out in 1955 on Atlantic. And what I've got here is a 1956 first British pressing mono, of course, which for me is a bit of an upgrade because I had a more recent, actually I still have, a more recent repress of this one, which came out on Atlantic Jazz Lore. They've snugged them up neat and tidily by cutting Lee out and sort of sticking him in here and then giving their shirts nice pastel colors. What you have here on this record are Lee Konitz and Warne Marsh, two-thirds of a collaborative, if you include the piano player Lenny Tristano, who stood kind of apart from the prevailing trend in modern jazz in the early and mid-1950s. Very influential on the cool school players, but it wasn't really part of the West Coast cool school. Having said that, I don't want to overstate this. If an alien came down and spent a week, researching on Steve Hoffman's music forums and then listened to this record, that alien would probably say, this is 1950s cool jazz, and you wouldn't be too far off. Konitz and Marsh recorded together quite frequently over the years, and at this point, although they weren't always bandmates, they'd been recording and playing together on and off for about 7 years. And so with that experience, they had actually, if not been bandmates, were getting to the point of being musical soulmates. And so this is a really good example of their work together. Lee Konitz was born in Chicago in October 1927 into a Jewish family. His parents were both immigrants. His dad came from Austria and his mom came from Russia. Theirs was not a musical household. It wasn't a particularly wealthy household. They ran basically a mom and pop laundry and they lived in the back of the store. Konitz grows up in the 1930s heavily influenced by Benny Goodman's music. So he picks up the clarinet initially, but then he adds the saxophone first on the tenor and then he moves on to the alto. He gets work with some of the, I guess, what you might call B-list jazz orchestras, Teddy Powell's orchestra, Jerry Wald's orchestra, which were touring the East Coast and the Midwest. In 1947, he joins Claude Thornhill's big band, and that was the opening of a door, he may not have known this at the time, to some pretty exciting happenings in the thinking and the playing of jazz. He began to work with Jerry Mulligan, who was with Thornhill, with the great arranger Gil Evans, and with the two of them became implicated with Miles Davis in trying to find a path forward from bebop and trying to find something which was more spacious, calmer, more melodic. And this, of course, leads to the birth of the Cool recording sessions between 1949 and 1951. Somewhere in here, probably after he'd had the exposure working with Davis and Thornhill, Konitz is invited to join Benny Goodman's band, which he turns down because he doesn't think it's going to be as innovative as some of the work he's doing, which is probably true. And as part of this immersion in innovation, in 1948, he joined Lenny Tristano's small group, and there he meets the tenor sax player, Warne Marsh. Marsh came from LA. He'd been born on October 27, just 2 weeks after Konitz. And while Konitz's parents had had, as I mentioned, a mom and pop laundry, Marsh came from much more rarefied circles. His dad was a famous cinematographer in Hollywood. His mom was a violin player, and 3 of his aunts were Hollywood actresses. As a kid, he started on the piano, but he soon became a multi-instrumentalist. His brother tells stories about how Warne, given a new instrument, could master it, if not in hours, then in merely a matter of days to get to performance level. He was too young to serve in the war, so in 43, 44, 45, he played locally in LA. He played at the Hollywood Canteen, which is a famous place where film stars served U.S. servicemen on leave. And then in 1946, he does join the Army, and there he meets Lenny Tristano, with whom he forms a real musical connection, and whom he follows to New York when they leave the Army in 1948. Tristano's influence on Konitz and Marsh was really distinct from the prevailing winds of hard bop and bebop. His emphasis was not on the pyrotechnics and the licks and the dynamics of bebop and some of the hard bop players, but more on the beauty of extended lines of soloing, basically letting the notes do the work. The beboppers thought this was cold and sterile, but this approach was embraced in the more chilled out world of the West Coast, and it becomes one of the threads out of which cool jazz is woven. Konitz, of course, was involved with Davis and Birth of the Cool. With Tristano and Marsh, he also did a whole series of singles for Prestige, actually the very first singles that were ever done for Prestige when it was still known as New Jazz Records in 1949. And I should also mention kind of amazing proto-free jazz that the 3 of them did with the rest of Tristano's sextet in 1949 on Capitol. Now these end up getting compiled as an EP called Classics in Jazz in 1954, but you can also get them, I think, on a Tristano compilation called Cross Currents. However, the problem with all of this work, despite the fact that it was artistically brilliant and hugely innovative, was that it was not putting bread on the table. Jerry Mulligan had to go out to the West Coast to make a living with Stan Kenton, and Konitz began to regret turning down Benny Goodman earlier because that was not very exciting, but it was a paying gig. So he too ends up joining Stan Kenton in the early 1950s. In 1953, again, through the connection not just with Kenton but with Mulligan, he becomes quite enmeshed with some of the most exciting stuff happening in jazz at the time, which was, of course, the Mulligan Baker Quartet. And he sits in with the Mulligan Quartet at The Hague for a number of memorable sessions in 1953, and those are first released on this Pacific Jazz, funny double covered EP, and then, of course, on a bunch of subsequent compilations. By 1955, he found himself back in New York and back in Lenny Tristano's orbit again, and it's around this time that this record happens. This record is made on June 14th, 1955, in New York at Atlantic Studios, with Nisui Erdogan as a producer and most likely Tom Dowd as the engineer. This is Konitz's first record for Atlantic. I was trying to figure out how that came to be, and what I discovered was that this record is recorded 3 days after Konitz is a sideman for Tristano at a recording session which Atlantic holds at a Chinese restaurant called the Confucius Room. Anyway, that's Tristano's first ever record for Atlantic, and I've got to conclude that it was the Tristano connection which leads Erdogan to ask Konitz to make this record. Konitz is on alto, Marsh is on tenor, Oscar Pettiford is on bass, and Kenny Clark, shortly before he was to move to France for good, is on drums. There are actually two other Tristano group alumni in here as well. Those include Sal Mosca on piano and Billy Bauer on guitar, and Bauer actually was on those proto free jazz recordings in 1949 on Capitol as well. On one track, Ronnie's Line, Mosca is replaced on piano by Ronnie Ball. Side one starts with Topsy. If you've never heard Konitz before, this is a good example of how distinct he is from other sax players. He plays these long lines in these solos, which almost kind of seem klezmerish. I may just be imagining that. And he contrasts really remarkably, but blends very well with Marsh, who has this soft, very idiosyncratic style of play. And that style of Marsh's is very evident on the next track, There Will Never Be Another You. Each individual note starts very softly and then kind of grows in volume like a mini crescendo, and it's a contrast to Konitz, who has a much crisper sound. Marsh is playing, all the notes seem to take time to develop. The third track is I Can't Get Started, which is a ballad, which slows things down and allows you to concentrate even more on the stylistic differences between the two players, which is kind of all you have to go on when it comes to who's playing, because although they're playing two different kinds of saxophones, the alto and the tenor, Marsh plays in the upper register of his tenor almost exclusively. Unless you're picking up the style, you don't know who's playing. That particular ballad has a very kind of liberal interpretation, but they're much more kind of tight and reverential on the last track on side one, which is Donna Lee, which of course is a Charlie Parker tune, and Parker had actually just died a month or two before this record was made. Side two starts with 2-Not-1, which is a Lenny Tristano tune, and it's one of the few times that Marsh actually descends down to the lower reaches of his instrument. The next track is Don't Squawk, which is by Oscar Pettiford, who of course is playing bass in this record. As far as I can tell, Pettiford wrote this for this session. He then records it himself on his own album, Oscar Pettiford Volume 2, a month later. And it stands out from the rest of the record. It's not a lighthearted romp like a lot of the tunes on here. It is certainly not a ballad. It's kind of a slow blues, I guess, and it's music to drink scotch by. Next is Ronnie's Line, where Ronnie Ball comes in for Sal Mosca on a tune that he wrote himself. And the last track is called Background Music. Now, the liner notes with respect to this track talk about Bach and chamber music, and I think with good reason, because there's a kind of open-endedness to them, which, in addition to the similar registers that the two horns are playing in, kind of makes this track seem like a continuous flow, kind of Bach-like, rather than a train of sort of boxcar lined up solos like you might have had on a Blue Note record. The work of Lee Konitz and Warne Marsh and Lenny Tristano, for that matter, in the 1950s, their collaborations are worth gathering because they really trod their own path. They weren't trying to mimic Parker, they weren't trying to mimic Davis, they weren't trying to mimic Coltrane. And on this record, without Tristano's influence, it's a little more relaxed and less cerebral than some of the work that those three guys did together. And as I mentioned, you could almost file this record under cool jazz. And above all, it's the interplay between Konitz and Marsh and Marsh's really unique sound, which make this record really worth seeking out, and I think it's a must-have for any 50s jazz collection. For me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.